and welcome to Ag PhD. I'm Darren Hefty.
And I'm Brian Hefty. Thanks for joining us today. All right, if you have spent some time this winter taking a look at your soil tests, it may be a little confusing, so we want to simplify that today, and we're going to talk about some of the very basic things and just a couple of the conversions you might want to look at on your soil test.
We're also going to talk about one of the toughest insects we've ever seen in soybeans. It's the soybean gall midge.
We've got a Weed of the Week and an Iron Talk coming up later in the show, but first, here's this week's Farm Basics.
Your soybeans are in the bin, but the game isn't over yet. Score more points this year by taking your beans to the end zone. At $10 beans, every point of moisture below your target takes away 15 cents per bushel. Reclaim that lost yield with the end zone bin system from Farm Shop MFG.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk about trying to get corn ears to be the same size on every plant throughout the field. How can you do that?
Well, one of the things that I see every corn harvest, there's a farmer that'll come to me and have a great big ear, and he'll say, Darren, what kind of yield do you think I'm going to get in my whole field? Well, judging by the one ear, it looks like 350 bushel corn to me. Does every ear in the whole field look like that? Well, no, that's kind of one of the nicer ones, and then there's some little ones and some short ones and maybe even a barren stalk here and there. Well, that is no way to estimate yield. Why don't we just focus on trying to get every plant to make that great big ear?
So one of the things that we've known for decades now is if you get all the plants to emerge at exactly the same time, then the ear size will be fairly similar.
And if they're spaced out, if the plants are spaced just perfectly as well. And that's one of the things that we see a lot. Now that uneven emergence is definitely a piece, and we'll talk about that a little more. But if your planter's not dropping that seed evenly and you're getting a lot of doubles and triples, with modern technology now and the things you can add to your planter and the monitors and so forth, there's just no excuse for it anymore. We've got to do a better job.
No. There's lots of excuse for it. It's really, well, seriously.
There are lots of excuses.
Think about it. You're dropping thousands of plants. You get a 24-row planter. You're dropping thousands of seeds out there every minute.
Especially if you're going to run 10 miles an hour with a high-speed planter.
Well, it doesn't matter. Even if you're running 4. The point is you're throwing lots of seed out. So I wouldn't go that far to say there's no excuse for it. There is, because we don't have good enough equipment yet to make it perfect. Let's say you were going to run over something that's this uneven, like what we're standing in right now. That's never going to work. So it goes hand in hand with how a farmer sets himself up in the fall, how you get set up in the spring, and then trying to reduce compaction as much as possible, make that good seed bed and everything else. But the big thing I wanted to focus on, I want to come back to that emergence. So yes, the spacing is important and all that, and I agree. But one of the things we tried this year that I wanted to talk about today is mowing off the tops of crops. And here's why. So I just said a minute ago, we've known this for decades, that, hey, if a plant comes up, let's say it's 1 leaf behind or 2 leaves behind, it comes up a few days later, or maybe a couple weeks later, then that plant that comes up behind will have a much, much smaller ear. So my thought was, well, is it really because it came up behind? Or is it just because the plant that's come up later is shaded out? So we thought, let's just run a little experiment at Ag PhD. So what we did is we mowed off plants where we had uneven planting depth and uneven emergence, just as an experiment. And unfortunately, the ears still turned out exactly like they would have before, at least we believe they did. And we saw that uneven ear size. So just evening the plant up later on, this was even at, I think, V5 or so, we evened the plants up, didn't work. So the point is, if you want even ears, you've got to have even emergence.
Well, it is really important. And even if you do get those things perfect, if you're in a dry land environment where there may be unevenness for moisture out in the field, you're going to see some uneven emergence too. So it's just really important as you head into the next planting season that you look at your equipment, that you go through your planter, that you be really fussy as you're doing the planting. I know we had some areas this past year in 2020 where farmers would call us and say, man, I'm not seeing moisture till I get down to 2 inches. inches, should I put my soybeans in another 1/2 inch deep? In many cases, the answer is yes. If you don't have moisture in the forecast, you may have to plant just a little bit deeper to get into some of that moisture in order to avoid that unevenness. But if you say, well, I'm going to stay with my 1.5 inch depth that I normally run it with, and parts of the field are going to be in moisture, parts of the field are not, you're certainly going to see uneven emergence.
Okay, when you have this uneven emergence, it's not a real big factor in terms of overall yield. That's the good thing. Is it a factor though? Yes. So to absolutely maximize yield, that's why we talk about the even plant spacing, the even emergence, and then ultimately, like with corn, the even ear size.
And one thing you don't even want to see out in your field is our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?
Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whenever you want. In your life and on your farm, Case IH AFS Connect gives you more control. Monitor your operation, manage your fleet and your farm data your way. Case IH, rethink productivity.
What I look for in a seed isn't just in the seed.
It's people I trust who get me the solve without the sell.
Who show me where their seed fits, and even where it doesn't.
Because the only innovation that matters is the one I need.
With NK Seeds, progress means pushing my potential.
And success matters.
Nature called. It wants its nutrients back. Don't flush them away. Use it where it's needed, precisely. TopCon has nutrient management technology to help make this process easier. How can you take advantage of this? Let us show you.
As a global planter consultant, YieldTrack caught my attention because it eliminated so many of the agronomic compromises that growers face. YieldTrack is a partnership between Case IH and Norwood Sales, and since 2012, it has been the only planter designed around tracks, as opposed to trying to figure out how to mount tracks to a planter. The results are a stronger, faster, and lighter machine that gives uniform seed depth placement while carrying more fertilizer and seed at a 14 psi footprint or less, impacting yields 8 to 19 bushel per acre depending on the wetness of the planting season, with a greater response the wetter the spring. Contact Norwood Sales to learn more on using a YieldTrack planter to improve your farm's profitability.
Pentair High-Pro Ultra-Low Drift nozzles are your ideal choice for the Enlist E3 herbicide system. With coverage comparable to flat fans and with 90% less drift, ULD nozzles meet all required standards for Enlist applications and provide optimal performance of contact herbicides. Learn more at pentair.com/hypro.
Unprotected nitrogen can go fast. Be like the tortoise, slow and steady. With High Striker, a stabilizer that protects nitrogen, keeping it available longer in the season and giving you more wins in your grain bin. Visit agrotechusa.com for more.
One of the worst new insect problems in soybeans is called the soybean gall midge, and believe it or not, this is a brand new insect to the world. Now, entomologists are super excited that they found a brand new insect. I am not excited at all because we have seen yield losses up to 100% in spots in fields. So today we're going to talk about soybean gall midge and how you can at least reduce the pressure on your farm moving forward.
Now, it is a pretty new bug. It's something we've been talking about for the last 5 years or so now, but it used to be in a very small pocket, and now the geography is spreading. So this bug is moving around into different parts, especially of the western corn belt, but that's not to say it's not going to end up everywhere soybeans are growing eventually. The key thing and the way that we want to try and go about stopping this is understanding that life cycle of the bug and finding the opportunity where we can treat for soybean gall midge.
Okay, so in the adult stage, it looks like a little fly. And what it will do is it will land on soybean plants, lay eggs inside the plant, then those eggs hatch, and there are worms that are going to feed on the inside of that soybean plant. Unfortunately, when it's on the inside, how are you going to get insecticide in there? Well, you can't just go spray over the top and get insecticide inside a soybean plant. That's not going to work. We've been talking to many of the ag chem manufacturers about, well, can you find something, or maybe even something you already have, that's systemic in the plant? We've even talked about Regent. How about Capture LFR in the soil? How about just something, anything that would give us some activity inside that plant? What can you do there? Unfortunately, we haven't found anything that's real great yet.
Well, there have been a lot of other things tried too, Brian, from cultural practices, for example, with tillage. Does tillage help? Is that going to stop gall midge larvae? Well, a lot of those adults are probably not going to be necessarily out in the field. They could be in the grass along the side as well. There could definitely be some of the larvae that are overwintering in some of the stubble. There's certainly going to be a little bit of an impact with that tillage, but it's not going to be a complete answer.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. We want you to know what's actually happening with this bug. So here's, in my opinion, what you should be looking for. It's probably going to be in the outside 24 rows of your soybeans, right next to where soybeans were raised last year. So if you want to prevent this bug from becoming a big problem in your field, well, you might have to plant continuous corn for a little while. You might have to do your field borders in corn and then go outside in the middle of the field to plant your soybeans. Since we don't have any great insecticide options, then we're looking at these cultural practices. I will tell you though, there have been some farmers who've talked to me that have said, hey, I've used really ridiculously high rates of bifenthrin, which is Capture, and gone out there a couple of times when the flies were coming through, sprayed, and then they actually had fairly decent control or reduction in gall midge issues. And when that would be is usually in our region, June.
Well, one other thing that's been tried is just changing up the planting date. If we can plant those soybeans late enough that the flies have already done their thing and gone and looked for soybean plants and didn't find them, and then our beans pop up after that, can we avoid the problem? Well, the answer is yes, you can, but you can also avoid a whole bunch of yield. If you're planting that late and you're going to wait a whole extra month before planting, that just has not been a good strategy that's going to be cost effective or profitability effective for farmers.
So at this point, we haven't found any varieties that are resistant to it or tolerant to it even. We haven't found any traits that help. We haven't found, hardly anything that you can do other than, like I say, don't plant soybeans next to where you planted soybeans last year. If you want to try some insecticide, we would suggest bifenthrin at least a couple of times in June when you're seeing those flies show up. But yes, this has been a real big problem in southeast South Dakota, northwest Iowa, northeast Nebraska. We're seeing some in southwest Minnesota, and it's just expanding out from there.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are no BT soybeans available to try to control this pest, so we're doing the best we can with cultural practices at this time. Well, one thing though that there is hope for is if you have our Weed of the Week, we've got answers for how to stop it. We'll share them later in the show.
Success isn't just about maintaining your operation, how you make out for the season, or how much you can get from each acre. It's about doing precisely what needs to be done to feed your crop and grow your legacy, all the way down to the last drop. AgroLiquid Precision Crop Nutrition. Apply less, expect more. Find a retailer at agroliquid.com.
Across the country and across county lines, no two operations are the same. So to keep your yield potential up and your fields clean, you need flexibility. Extend Flex Soybeans, the industry's first soybean with triple tolerance to dicamba, glyphosate, and now glufosinate, giving you the yield you want and the choice you need. Extend Flex Soybeans.
Find love, and then give it all away. Find love, then give it all away.
Who says harvest should be the only rewarding part of the season? Sure, ending a successful year of planning and planting is a very gratifying moment. But with the Bayer Plus Rewards program on your side, it doesn't have to be the only one. By helping you earn and redeem cash back on seed, herbicides, and other eligible products you use throughout the entire season, you can reap the benefits all year round. So contact your retailer to learn how to get more from your crops and put more in your wallet. Bayer Plus. Rewards are always in season.
Maintaining your crops is as important now as it's ever been. Howler, a revolutionary fungicide from AgBiome, can help. It provides long-lasting protection from a broad spectrum of foliar and soil diseases that affect crops. Howler is OMRI listed, has multiple modes of action, and has minimal pre-harvest and re-entry intervals. It's flexible, easy to use, and is available right now. Visit agbiome.com/howler to learn more.
Downtime during spraying can lead to huge yield losses. Keep rolling with the Pentair Hypro Force Field. This pump features a unique self-regulated chamber that allows the pump to run dry while eliminating cracked seals, so you can spray longer and more reliably. Learn more at pentair.com/hypro.
Darren and I talk to farmers almost every day about soil tests, soil test results, fertilizer recommendations, and what we always say is, hey, this fertility thing is a really big deal. It's so important because you're going to probably in your lifetime spend at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars on fertilizer. What we want you to do is to know how to read that soil test so you have a better idea how to invest your dollars wisely so you can make as much money on your farm as possible. Well, today we want to talk about simplifying that soil test and look at just some basic soil conversions. Let's start with the parts per million to pounds per acre conversion.
Well, for most folks, and maybe you're one of them that looks at a soil test, you think this is a big math problem. There really isn't a whole lot of math, as Brian said. There's just a few things that you need to kind of keep in mind here. And the first one would be when you see numbers that are shown as parts per million, how do you turn them into pounds per acre? With most soil tests, they're going to represent 6 inches of soil. And in every 3 inches of soil across 1 acre, there's roughly 1 million pounds. So if you have a 6-inch soil test, you've got roughly a representation of 2 million pounds of soil. So when you see parts per million on a soil test, all you have to do on a 6-inch soil test is multiply that times 2 to get pounds per acre.
Now let's say you had a 12-inch soil core. Well, that's representing 4 million pounds, so you just take your parts per million number times 4 and so on. The reason why this is so important is because, let's face it, as farmers, we don't farm in parts per million. We don't buy our fertilizer in parts per million. We buy pounds. We're looking for pounds per acre. Now here's the next thing that you may not have even thought of before with potassium. Okay, let's say you have 0060. All right, everybody knows about potash, it's 0060. But is it really 0060? You know what that 60% is? It's actually K2O potassium. So if your soil test says potassium, that's not K2O. Here's what I mean. Let's say that the soil test says 100 parts per million of potassium. Well, in order to convert that over to K2O potassium, you'd have to multiply that times 1.2. So your 100 becomes 120 parts per million of K2O potassium. So again, potash isn't actually 0060 for potassium. That 60% is K2O potassium. It's only 50% actual potassium.
Phosphorus is another one, Brian, to convert to phosphate that you really need to understand. And like I said, to start this off, there's just a few mathematical calculations you need to know, and you can be a soil test whiz. For phosphorus, to convert to phosphate, you just multiply that times 2.3. So if you have 20 parts per million of phosphorus times 2.3, that's going to be 46 parts per million of phosphate.
Now the reason why that's important is because you don't buy phosphorus fertilizer. You say, what? Yes, I do. Of course I buy phosphorus fertilizer. I buy MAP or DAP every year. Well, MAP or DAP is phosphate. When we say 1846O or 1152O, that 46 and that 52, those numbers in the middle, they're not phosphorus. Those are phosphate numbers. And I realize if this is the first time you're hearing this, maybe you're a young farmer or maybe you don't even farm and you go, boy, this really sounds confusing. Look, if let's say I owned a soil lab, How would I represent everything? It'd be in pounds, it'd be in K2O potassium, it'd be in phosphate. But for whatever reason, soil labs don't do it that way. So we're just telling you, hey, let's just convert the phosphorus. Real simple to do, like Darren said, multiply times 2.3. Now you get phosphate pounds, and now we're all talking the same language.
All right, the last one, Brian, again, here's another one to get to the 8. We have sulfur to sulfate. What's the calculation?
All right, pretty simple again. You just take your sulfur number times 3, and that will give you sulfate. So if you had, let's say, 10 pounds of sulfur in your soil, well, you actually have 30 pounds of sulfate in your soil. So it just depends on how you're buying your fertilizer, what it is. And again, the reason why we're bringing this up, and I know it sounds a little confusing and you're going, oh my goodness, I got to have somebody else do all this for me. No, these are about the only calculations that we ever even use. So again, it's parts per million to pounds per acre. Just multiply times 2 if it's a 6-inch test. If it's K to K2O, just multiply times 1.2 to get your potassium numbers over to K2O potassium. For phosphorus, you take your phosphorus number times 2.3 to get phosphate. And for sulfur, just multiply that one times 3 to get the sulfate.
Well, soil tests may seem a little bit complicated to you, but weed control is straightforward. We'll give you the straightforward answers on how to stop our weed of the week coming up next.
Nature called. It wants its nutrients back. Don't flush them away. Use it where it's needed, precisely. TopCon has nutrient management technology to help make this process easier. How can you take advantage of this? Let us show you.
Weed of the week is another tough perennial weed. It's Honeyvine milkweed.
There are a number of factors that can make a weed very difficult to control. This one not only is a perennial, but it's also a vine. And when we run into both of those in the same plant, our options become limited quite quickly.
Well, like we usually say with perennial weeds, we need something systemic, something that's going to get down and not just kill the top growth, but something that's going to get way down into the root system and kill it off completely. The best answer, just like with most weeds, it's Roundup. So if you have the opportunity to spray Roundup, then make sure you're using the highest labeled rate and you should be in pretty good shape.
Here's the challenge though. Roundup's not great normally on vines. Now on this particular vine, it can work okay, but you gotta get it early. Once that plant starts vining out, now it's got growing points all over, and many of them will be under the cover of your desirable plants. And that makes it tough to get product on them. So as Brian said, you've got to have a good strong dose to move through that plant. And the big thing here is to get to every one of those growing points.
As you say that though, Darren, sometimes we'll see a whole patch that's out there and it's all connected. And there will also be some pieces that are below ground that don't even have a shoot yet. Well, that's the reason why we don't want to do tillage there before we spray the Roundup or Tordon or whatever it is that's systemic that's going to work through that plant. So try to avoid tillage in those areas. When you till, you actually many times make the problem worse.
There's a little bit of debate out there about Honeyvine milkweed of should I use Sharpen in my burn down with the Roundup? Will the Sharpen burn the plant too fast that it won't take the Roundup in?
I would say leave it out, but if all you're doing is a little bit of burn down, the weather isn't right for Roundup, you're not using a high rate of Roundup anyway, then sure, burn it down with something Sharpen, dicamba, 2,4-D, anything like that would be fine.
When we get into wheat, that is our best option, that burn down with Roundup or Roundup and Sharpen, because post-emerge we don't have any really good answers other than maybe Husky might burn it back a little bit. In corn we do have a good post-emerge answer, Status, although it's a little expensive, it does a pretty nice job if you can get the weed when it's small.
Yep, and in soybeans I would use a 2,4-D or dicamba tolerant bean if you don't want to use just a straight Roundup bean. So you need something else because in conventional beans this is pretty tough to control.
That's all the time we have for this week's weed, Honeyvine milkweed, but Iron Talk is coming up next.
My name is Amos Smith. I'm a 4th generation dairy farmer in Western New York. We considered strip till about 3 years ago. We usually have a wider harvest window because we're not compacting the soil and we're not faced with too mellow a soil in the fall. The soils are a lot healthier. The machine, you know, it's definitely rugged. It's a great system overall. It's a good fit for our operation.
Success isn't just about maintaining your operation, how you make out for the season, or how much you can get from each acre. It's about doing precisely what needs to be done to feed your crop and grow your legacy, all the way down to the last drop. AgroLiquid Precision Crop Nutrition. Apply less, expect more. Find a retailer at agroliquid.com.
How much does your crop residue cost you? Over time, residue accumulates in your fields, building excess carbon levels and tying up your plant-available nitrogen. Residue also traps P, K, and micros and can take years to naturally become available to your crops. This is because soil lacks the diverse microbial life needed to break it all down. With Decomp, you can naturally restore life to your soils and allow the release of valuable crop fertility. Learn more at heftyseed.com/naturals.
Your soybeans are in the bin, but the game isn't over yet. Score more points this year by taking your beans to the end zone. If your beans went in the bin at low moisture, you can naturally rehydrate to reclaim lost yield with the End Zone Fan Control System from Farm Shop MFG. At $10 beans, every point of moisture below your target takes away 15 cents per bushel. That means raising 9% moisture beans to 13 can increase your profits by 60 cents per bushel. Score more yields in the end zone from Farm Shop MFG.
Iron Talk is brought to you by Case IH.
Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whenever you want. In your life and on your farm, Case IH AFS Connect gives you more control. Monitor your operation, manage your fleet and your farm data your way. Case IH. Rethink productivity.
We'll talk about one of the new innovations for disease and insect protection in today's Iron Talk. As dry insecticide boxes have ceased to be standard equipment on new planters, several alternatives have appeared on the market. One of the newest options you have is the Thrive 3D system from FMC. With the closed handling system and the ability to allow you to plant all day on a single fill, it's definitely catching some attention from farmers and is beginning to build quite a following. The big functional difference from anything else in the market is that the Thrive 3D system turns liquid insecticide into a foam that covers 50 times more surface area in the furrow for improved insect control. The other change is you won't be constantly filling tanks during the day. Even with a 24-row planter, you won't outplant the system and need multiple fills. Plus, with the increased speeds of modern planters, the Thrive 3D system places an accurate dose in the furrow regardless of speed. In the past, insecticide has been the major focus with this equipment, but that's beginning to change. Xyway fungicide has excellent systemic movement from in-furrow applications and is now available in the Thrive 3D platform. We used it on our farm in 2020, and wouldn't you know it, we ended up with a dry year with virtually no disease pressure. However, nationwide, Xyway looked fantastic for its protection from gray leaf spot, northern and southern corn leaf blights, and more. If applying fungicide later in the season has been a challenge for you, or if you farm in an area that has a strong history of corn diseases, take a look at Xyway as it sure appears to have the potential for a high return on your investment. To wrap things up, if you're looking for a way to apply insecticide and potentially fungicide too with your planter, Thrive 3D is a system to consider for your farm. That's all for today's Iron Talk, and now back to the show.
That's all the time we have for today's show, but before we go, we'd encourage you to check out the Ag PhD magazine. If you're looking for more information on that, just go to agphdinsider.com.
And don't miss the next Ag PhD TV show. We'll have another Weed of the Week, Farm Basics, Iron Talk, and a whole lot more. I'm Darren Hefty.
And I'm Brian Hefty. Thanks for watching Ag PhD.